Buenas tardes, de Dios. Good evening. As Sylvia mentioned, there's probably few events in the history of the United States that have been more controversial than the Mexican-American War of 1846, 1848. The Mexicans call it the Guerra de la Intervención Norteamericana. So, that gives you an entirely different perspective. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the hostilities between the two countries in 1848, but the war at that point had cost Mexico half of its territory, and more importantly for us, it had basically changed the destinies of all of those that lived in that vast region that we today call the American Southwest. I will discuss only very briefly the events that led to the war with Mexico in 1846 and concentrate on the subsequent military occupation of New Mexico, and then try to, if Laura doesn't pull me at the end of my 20 minutes too quickly, the critical events that followed the occupation, which are history books called the Revolt of 1847 and the treason trials. The occupation of New Mexico by U.S. troops in 1846 reminds one of the colonization by Juan de Oñate in 1598 and the well-known reconquest of New Mexico by Diego de Vargas in 1692. That's the one that's celebrated every year in Santa Fe for the fiestas. All three events are often characterized as bloodless and peaceful because each of these was accomplished without firing a shot. Like the revolt at Acoma in 1599 and the 1693 Pueblo revolt that followed the Vargas peaceful reconquest of 1692, the permanent occupation of New Mexico by American troops in 1846 was anything but bloodless and peaceful. Within 6 months of that August 1846 occupation, as many as 300 New Mexicans had died in battles against the U.S. Army, and at least 24 others were hanged for actions that they took in defense of their country. I will contend, and I have, that our challenge as scholars will be to decide if we are going to continue to regard the New Mexicans who resisted U.S. occupation as rebels and traitors, or rather as Mexican patriots who died in defense of their country. Now, the declaration of war between the United States and Mexico was issued on the 13th of May of 1846, but the seeds of this conflict had been sown a decade earlier when Texas declared its independence from Mexico in 1836. Almost as soon as the Texas Republic was born, it became clear it was only a matter of time before this fledgling nation would itself become part of an expanding United States of America, a country whose borders were creeping westward. It was a country that seemed to be intent on achieving its destiny, its manifest destiny, it was called at the time, to encompass the continent from sea to shining sea. Now, the election of James K. Polk as President of the United States in 1844 sparked a series of events that finally led to war. Polk had been elected on an expansionist platform that supported Texas annexation and sought to extend the boundaries of the United States to the Pacific coast. In July of 1845, the United States Congress began this process when it voted to annex the Republic of Texas, and soon after the Mexican government refused to sell almost half of its territory to the U.S., President Polk ordered the American Army under Zachary Taylor to the Rio Grande, quote, to defend the Rio Grande. By late April of 1846, elements of the American and Mexican armies had engaged in skirmishes along the border, and when news of the clashes reached Washington, President Polk could claim that American blood had been spilled on American soil and had been done so by a foreign aggressor. On the 13th of May, 1846, Congress acknowledged that a state of war existed with Mexico. Within a month of that declaration of war, the American Army of the West, commanded by Colonel, later to become General Stephen Watts Kearney, began its march along the Santa Fe Trail west towards the undefended northern Mexican frontier. By late July, Kearney and his troops had reached the northern border of Mexican territory at the Napeste, which we now call the Arkansas River, and on the 31st of July of 1846, while he was at camp at Bent's Fort, he issued the first of his proclamations regarding the occupation of New Mexico. This is a quote: "The undersigned enters New Mexico with a large military force for the purpose of seeking union with and ameliorating the condition of its inhabitants." This he does under instructions from his government and with the assurance that he will be amply sustained in the accomplishment of this object. It is enjoined on the citizens of New Mexico to remain quietly at their homes and to pursue their peaceful avocations. As long as they continue such pursuits, they will not be interfered with by the American Army, but will be respected and protected in their rights, both civil and religious. All who take up arms or encourage resistance against the government of the United States will be considered as enemies and will be treated accordingly. Kearney and his forces marched unopposed into New Mexico, and on the 15th of August, 1846, the American Army reached Las Vegas, where Kearney climbed on the roofs of one of the buildings that surrounded the plaza and proclaimed himself governor. After forcing a number of local officials to take an oath of allegiance to the new government, Kearney and his troops proceeded west towards the New Mexican capital in Santa Fe. 3 days later, the American Army entered Santa Fe without opposition. On August the 22nd, Kearney issued a formal proclamation that reiterated his possession of New Mexico and the residents that assembled in the historic plaza that their rights to property and freedom of worship would be protected. He also promised they would soon be provided a right to, quote, a free government similar to that of the United States. Then he concluded, the United States hereby absolves all persons residing within the boundaries of New Mexico from any further allegiance to the Republic of Mexico, and hereby claims them as citizens of the United States. Those who remain quiet and peaceful will be considered good citizens and receive protections. Those who are found in arms or instigating others against the United States will be considered traitors and treated accordingly. Now, it was later determined that Kearney exceeded his authority in doing this. The day he presumed to confer United States citizenship of the people of New Mexico, he absolved them of any loyalty to the Mexican Republic, but this was an action that Congress reserved to itself. His error in presuming to confer citizenship would soon weigh heavily on the lives of those who later chose to resist the American occupation by allowing them, in the minds of the occupying force, to be considered traitors against the United States. Now, the reasons why the Americans were able to take New Mexico without firing a shot are varied, they're complex, and we can't get into that today. Juan Bautista Vigil, the Secretary of Government, a position which would be similar to today's Secretary of State under Manuel Armijo, was apparently the ranking government official remaining in Santa Fe after Armijo fled the country. Vigil y Alari's formal response to Kearney's proclamation noted a reluctant acceptance of this fiat accompli. It says, the sincere, honorable, and hardworking inhabitants of this department offer their deference to the government of North America. No one in the world has successfully resisted the power of the stronger. Your Excellency, do not think it strange that we have not manifested joy and enthusiasm in seeing your city occupied by your military forces. To us, the political entity of the Mexican Republic has died. She, regardless of her circumstances, was our mother. What son does not shed copious tears at the tomb of his parents? Now, General Kearney's proclamation could contain stern warnings to the citizens of New Mexico. He pointed out that his forces were equal to the task of suppressing any kind of opposition, and he made it clear, quote, that it would be foolish, ignorant, and downright insanity for any discontented person to even think of resisting. He also took initial steps to establish a civil government under the new American regime, and on September the 22nd, he appointed Charles Bent as civil governor, Donaciano Vigil as secretary of the territory, and other officials, including judges Joab Houghton, Jose Antonio Otero, and Charles Beaubien, to reside over the new system of district courts. Charles Bent, Donaciano Vigil. And 2 weeks later, he issued the laws of the territory of New Mexico, the legal code that became the basis for civil government in New Mexico. This codification of American law has become more commonly known as the Kearney Code. With this new civil government in place, all seemed quiet in New Mexico. And for the remainder of 1846, there's not a lot of evidence of overt opposition to the new government. So while war raged in New Mexico, the former Mexican territory of New Mexico appeared to be under peaceful occupation. But the silence was deceptive. That fall, reports were bandied about names of individuals who were speaking out against the occupation and encouraging resistance. Governor Bent was concerned enough to impose a strict 10 p.m. curfew in Santa Fe. And in mid-November, Francisco Sarracino, who was the prefect of New Mexico Southern District, reported widespread discontent among a number of influential individuals, including Diego Archuleta and Jose Maria Chavez. He seemed to suggest these individuals considered Sarracino, Donaciano Vigil, and others as collaborators and traitors. Things heated up in December. After General Kearney departed New Mexico for California, military command was assumed by Colonel Sterling Price. Governor Bent informed Price that a group of men that had been headed by Diego Archuleta and Tomas Ortiz were trying to excite the citizens of New Mexico against the American government. And later that December, Bent ordered the arrest of several men who were described as secondary conspirators in a plot to overthrow the new government. 5 of the suspects were turned over to Colonel Price because Bent felt that the military authorities could deal with them better than the civil government. 2 other unnamed leaders, presumably Tomas Ortiz and Diego Archuleta, were still being sought, and these arrests apparently stymied an uprising originally planned for the 19th of December, 1846. So despite these arrests, planning for an uprising against the Americans continued, and on the 19th of January, a large group of armed men attacked the home of Governor Bent at Don Fernando de Taos, and by the end of the day, Governor Bent and other officials of the recently appointed civil government lay dead. Within 2 days, the uprising had spread through much of northern New Mexico, and several other Americans and Mexican supporters of the new government had been killed. News of Governor Bent's death arrived in Santa Fe on January the 20th, and Price hastily organized his forces, and on the 23rd, marched north from Santa Fe with nearly 400 troops and several pieces of artillery that would prove instrumental in the battles that would ensue. Price's force included a company of volunteers under Sir Ron St. Vrain that were recruited among the American merchants, Santa Fe Trail freighters, and others who were at the capital when Price received news of the insurrection. St. Vrain's company, incidentally, included 7 men with Spanish surnames. The following day, January the 24th, Colonel Price's forces engaged and dispersed a force of approximately 1,500 New Mexicans at Santa Cruz de la Cañada, about 25 miles north of Santa Fe. The official report of the encounter tells us that the American troops suffered 2 men killed and 6 wounded, while 36, quote, rebels were killed. In the meantime, the insurgents retreated to the strategic gorge of the Rio Grande north of Santa Cruz near Embudo along the principal route to Taos. On the 27th, Price advanced to Los Luceros and 2 days later engaged the New Mexican forces at La Joya, between La Joya, which is today's Velarde, and Embudo, and when the smoke cleared, the American forces controlled the pass and the New Mexicans retreated to Taos, where they regrouped and fortified themselves at the pueblo of San Jerónimo de Taos. Casualty reports for the Battle of Embudo show New Mexicans suffered approximately 20 men killed and 60 wounded, while the American troops had 1 man killed and several wounded. Now, while Colonel Price and his troops were engaging the New Mexican forces at Santa Cruz and Embudo, a number of American traitors had been killed on the east side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the vicinity of Mora. A force of American troops from Las Vegas responded to the attacks by assaulting the settlement of Mora on January the 24th. Their initial assault was repulsed by the New Mexicans, but a week later, the U.S. forces returned to Mora, and on February the 1st, mounted a devastating artillery barrage, which forced the New Mexicans to abandon their position. The American troops then entered Mora and proceeded to raze the community to the ground. At least 25 New Mexicans were reported killed in these actions, and the fate of several prisoners taken at Mora by the Americans is unknown. Back on the west side of the Sangre de Cristo, Colonel Price continued his advance on Taos. On February the 3rd, he marched to the settlements of Don Fernando, commenced an artillery barrage on the pueblo of Taos, where the New Mexicans and their pueblo allies had fortified themselves. Late the following morning, Price's troops began their assault on the pueblo along 2 fronts. The Americans managed to fight their way past the outer defenses, but were unable to dislodge the New Mexicans from the church of San Jerónimo because of the massive adobe walls which protected them from the artillery. Finally, that afternoon at 3 o'clock of February the 4th, the Americans wheeled the biggest gun they had, a 6-pounder, to within 60 yards of the church and began to batter the wall at a spot where an earlier attempt to chop through the walls with axes had been beaten back. When the wall was breached, the cannon was brought up to point-blank range, and several rounds of grape shot were poured into the hole. The onslaught was too much. A general retreat ensued as the Americans stormed through the breach. And at this point, several hundred Mexicans and Pueblo allies abandoned the Pueblo and attempted to escape. According to several sources, Saran St. Vrain's company pursued those that fled, and according to all reports, they did so with an apparent enthusiasm, as his men killed more than 50 before they reached the safety of the hills. Various sources estimate that between 150 and 200 defenders died at the Pueblo, bringing the total number of New Mexicans who died on the battlefields of northern New Mexico to nearly 300, although we don't actually know if that number is accurate. Several dozen survivors were captured, including Pablo Montoya and Tomas Romero, who were identified as principal leaders in the insurrection. Romero was killed the following day, shot by a nervous guard while allegedly trying to escape. On February the 6th, Colonel Price convened a military court to try Pablo Montoya and several other individuals for their part. 3 separate charges were lodged against Montoya, including that on the day of the 19th of January, 1847, the day Governor Bent was killed, Montoya, quote, did excite the Indians and Mexicans to rebellious conduct, and that he had issued a proclamation, quote, exciting the people to rebellion, and finally that he had conspired to, quote, rob the United States wagons loaded with public funds. While it is possible to interpret these charges as being synonymous with treason, contrary to many published sources, I have not found the word treason in any of the charges brought against Pablo Montoya. Despite that, justice was meted out quickly to Pablo Montoya. He was indicted, tried, convicted, and sentenced to hang, all in that first day of court. According to the death warrant issued by Colonel Price, Montoya was hanged on the 7th of February, 1847, sometime between 11 in the morning and 2 o'clock that afternoon, in the center of the Plaza of Don Fernando. After that, the scene shifts to Santa Fe, where the treason trials, quote unquote, were held. The first trial was Antonio Maria Trujillo of Los Ojos, who was indicted and convicted of treason against the United States. Now, he was his conviction and the sentence to die seems to have sent a shockwave through the community. And in the days that followed, there seems to have been indictments. The grand jury that indicted the other, Pantaleon Archuleta and Trinidad Barcelo, their trials ended up in hung juries and their charges were dropped. The reason for these things is unclear, but it appears that it was determined that Kearney had no jurisdiction, or the court had no jurisdiction to try Mexican citizens for treasons, and all the other prisoners were apparently released. In the meantime, more than 40 men, probably the ones captured with Pablo Montoya the past February, were still being held in Taos. To deal with these, a civil court was convened on April the 5th with Charles Beaubien, whose son, Jose Narcisco Beaubien, was one of the men killed in Taos in January 15th, 19th provided. Now, at least 16 other prisoners held at Taos were somehow singled out and indicted for murder in the January 19th killing of Governor Bent and other American officials. The extant court records show that 10 additional convictions for murder before court adjourned at Taos, and all 10 received sentences of death by hanging. If all the hangings were carried out as scheduled, the last 10 condemnations brought the total number of executions from the April 1847 Taos trials to 17. But it wasn't over yet. In July of 1847, 3 U.S. soldiers were killed near Los Valles, a settlement that's just south of Las Vegas. And whether or not suspicion was warranted or not, the United States troops descended on the Valles and literally erased the community from the face of the earth. And by the end of the month, 6 of the men that had been taken from Los Valles had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. So during January and February of 1847, like I said, approximately 300 New Mexicans were killed in battles associated with the insurrection. Survivors who witnessed the execution of 21 of their countrymen for murder, 1 for treason and another for the dubious charge of fomenting rebellious conduct. The deaths of all these individuals proved once and for all that Kearney's early warning against armed resistance was futile. And this particular period carried serious consequences. The ruins of San Jeronimo Church, where the insurrectionists took their last refuge, still stand as evidence that the Pueblo of Taos incurred severe damage. The communities of Mora and Los Valles were in ruins. The villages around Santa Cruz and Embudo were no doubt damaged, maybe even deserted. Scores of men were dead and others undoubtedly seriously impaired by wounds. Dozens of widows and possibly hundreds of orphans were left without proper care and support. Certainly, this great loss of men as spring approached impacted the ability of northern New Mexico communities to plant crops needed for their subsistence. Perhaps one day, an enterprising student, Sylvia, will take a close look at the U.S. Census for 1850 and see if at that moment there were an inordinate number of families headed by women in the counties of Rio Arriba, Taos, and Mora. Now, we know very little about the motives of the men who decided to take up arms against the Americans in 1847. I've been unable to determine whether individual actions were based on patriotism, hate, fear, or some other reason. Yet history has and continues to label those who participated in these tragic events of 1847 as rebels and traitors, despite the belatedly acknowledged fact that the courts convened in Taos and Santa Fe had no authority to condemn Mexican citizens for treason against the United States. Our history books have treated the persons involved in these events anonymously. Men of influence who have written of these events often used derogatory terms to describe those who took up arms against the United States. A.B. Dyer, writing about the trial and execution of the Los Valles group in August 1847, alluded to these men and New Mexicans in general as, quote, miserable, ignorant, deluded wretches. The mass of the people are so degraded, he said, that they are totally unfit to become citizens of a free United States. A generation later, Territorial Secretary William Rich, in his eloquent eulogy of Donaciano Vigil, ascribed the events of that period to, quote, the discontent and dissensions among the pueblos and the more ignorant and vicious classes in remote districts, unquote. More recently, even Fray Angelico Chavez dismissed these Mexican patriots as little more than, quote, young, hot-blooded caballeros who had declined to swear allegiance to the new country. Now, when painted with such vicious descriptions, no wonder these men quickly became and have remained undeserving of any recognition and honor. For nearly 2 decades, I have suggested it may be time that instead of the disgraceful anonymity in which these events have been held by history, we dare to consider that the events of those tragic days should even be called a revolt or an insurrection. Could simple resistance be more appropriate? And if so, we must face the challenge of considering that the men, and yes, possibly even some women, who died resisting the American invasion those fateful days of 1847 should be worthy of being remembered and honored, not as rebels and traitors, but as Mexican patriots who died defending their country. Thank you.